It's the big peaks in dopamine that are not associated with any prior effort or organization of self that are particularly dangerous for the human being.
Yep.
One thing that we know, again, about the dopamine system, it's about anticipation. The other thing that is absolutely clear about the dopamine system is that it is tacked to pursuit more than it is to outcomes, but it is highly subjective to interpretation. And this is exciting, actually, and holds great possibility. I mean, one thing about the dopamine system that's so important and also explains a lot of pathology, but also a lot of human evolution, is that we have basically one major reward system, which is the dopaminergic system. I sometimes like the analogy that, nowadays you hear about cryptocurrency or the dollar versus the euro versus the this versus the that. There's only one currency in all of reality, actually, and it's dopamine. Whether or not it's the dollar-backed dopamine or it's euro-backed dopamine or Bitcoin-backed dopamine. In the end, whether or not someone has $1 billion or $2 is really that currency resides as something that's transacted in the real world, but their notion of power and potential is dopaminergic. The dopaminergic system that we're talking about, anticipation and then action and reward, or in some cases, no reward, right? And the ability to persist toward a goal regardless, is a generalizable system. You had that chapter about, get your room in order, right? Get your belongings in order. This is, I think, very relevant right now. Even though it's important to have higher goals and lofty goals, the dopamine system is an incredible system because it is depletable, and yet it's also renewable, and it is self-amplifying. What I mean by that is, let's say that I'm somebody who doesn't know what I'm working toward. I don't have a specific goal or question. By completing even what seem like menial tasks, like making myself a cup of coffee, drinking it, cleaning up completely, drying the cup and putting it back in the cupboard, what happens is even if you make that seemingly trivial goal the goal, in addition to making the kitchen look nicer, it completes a circuit. It closes the dopaminergic circuit. And when dopamine is released, and it will be, maybe not to the same extent as publishing a novel, but to some extent, dopamine amplifies our ability to think into the future, to make additional plans that are unrelated to what you just did, and it literally increases confidence and energy. Why? Well, for the following reason. We all think about caloric energy, but what most people are never taught, and if I had 10 things I could teach people, one of them would be adrenaline, epinephrine, is neural energy. It's your ability to get up and go. It's the thing that makes you jittery when you're a little nervous, but it's also what allows you to move forward, to go out for a run, to pursue any goal, cognitive or physical, etc. Epinephrine, which is also adrenaline, those are the same thing, is literally manufactured from the molecule dopamine. If you look at the biochemical cascade, dopamine is converted into adrenaline, which is the basis of all energy, all neural energy.
Right.
And so, including thinking. And so if one is not in a place of being able to set their goal on a particular lofty goal, a graduate degree, a book, etc., yet the way one gets to that is by completing things in their immediate environment from start to finish and closing the dopaminergic loop.
Tell me what you think about this. My understanding of the prefrontal cortex is that over the course of evolutionary time, it grew out of the frontal cortex and that out of the motor cortex more specifically. And so the best way to think about what the prefrontal cortex does in some sense is that it generates potential abstract patterns of action. It generates them in abstraction so that they can be assessed before they're implemented. And so it's like it's generating potential future selves.
That's exactly right.
That's okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay,
and I'm glad you stated it, not I, because you stated it far more clearly and succinctly than I've heard it stated before. It's as if it's running plays. I'm using a sports analogy. It's running plays and thinking about potential outcomes.
But with human beings, what we seem to have done is evolved a mechanism for manufacturing artificial selves in this game-like manner. And so we can put forward optional selves in abstraction and then kill them off when they're not necessary without us dying. And so the famous quote, I think it was Alfred North Whitehead, was that the purpose of thought was to let our thoughts die instead of us.
I love that.
And it really makes us unique. Yeah, it's great. It's absolutely great. And then it seems to me too, you tell me what you think about this, is that the abstracted artificial selves, avatars in some sense, that the prefrontal cortex generates, or that it allows these underlying motivational and emotional systems to generate, because they can generate simple avatars by themselves. I think when we describe those, we're telling stories. When we describe one of these alternative modes of action, that's precisely it. It's the verbal description of that is a story.
That's right. And you make a very important point, which is that the prefrontal cortex is a rule-changing, alternate self-accessing machine that can also calm the body. And I think what you're getting to is what we know is that the prefrontal cortex and its associated networks contain a near infinite, if not infinite, set of possibilities. Right? I mean, of course, it's bottlenecked by experience and it's bottlenecked by one's imagination. But the number of different possible selves that one could imagine is near infinite if one were to spend time on it. Whereas the number of different bodily states that one can have are actually very finite. And if you think about the autonomic nervous system and in my laboratory, we've studied this typically in the context of fear and confrontation, that the simplest way to put this in a kind of pop neuroscience way would be to say, we can either be back on our heels, meaning retreating, or we can be flat-footed, sort of calm in our stance, or we can be forward center of mass. We can be in sort of pursuit and or competition. There really aren't other motor responses for an animal, including humans, right? You can either stay put, back up, or go forward. And this is...
Yeah, well, it's useful for people to know that that's the basic platform upon which emotions are erected too, is that emotions are like signals of those action tendencies, and they are very simple. It's back up, get away, stop, or move forward. Right. And so generally we associate positive emotion with forward movement, and that would be positive emotion that's dopaminergically mediated fundamentally.
Right.
And then the halting would be, well, it can be calmness because there's nothing to do, but it can also be the paralysis that fear induces. And then panic and retreat are they're sort of on the border between anxiety and pain, I suppose. Pain responses.
Yeah, exactly right.
It's complicated yeah.
Okay. So these three major categories, I think, encompass most, if not all, of the possible responses, as you said, and probably form the base set for all emotions. Here's the answer. There are two modes of changing these responses in the neural circuitry. One lies in so-called neuroplasticity, which is could be strengthening of synapses or just reordering of nerve connections. Could be the addition of new cells. There's a lot of excitement about the addition of new neurons, but really that only reflects a small percentage of changes in the brain of adults. It's actually more the rewiring of existing connections, but the mechanism doesn't matter so much. Something gets rewired such that the response is then different going forward. And indeed that happens. Any system that taps into the dopamine system, and indeed everything we're talking about today does, is highly subject to reward-induced neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
In fact, so much so that some of the best experiments done on this have shown that if you give somebody a drug that transiently increases dopamine, works better if you also transiently increase acetylcholine or something like that as well. But for the next hours, 1 to 4 hours, the neuroplasticity is scaled up, right? It takes many fewer trials or many fewer cognitive behavioral therapy sessions. This has only been done a few times, or many fewer learning sessions to create a permanent shift in the neurology such that...
So does that mean that if you believe when you are at the outset of a task that you're doing something important, so you're approaching a valued goal, and you have a lot of anticipation as a consequence of that, does that mean that you put yourself in a neurochemical state that facilitates learning?
Absolutely, without question.
So if you believe what you're doing is important, if you truly believe that because it's related to an important goal and it's a pathway forward, then that's going to transform into a manifestation of neuroplasticity.
Absolutely. And every time I hear about the sort of, woo statements about, I don't want to offend anyone here, but sure, I'll just say, you hear about the secret or manifesting or intention, all of that is it's capturing a fundamental principle of the way that our neurology works, which is that the prefrontal cortex, as a rule-setting but flexible rule-setting machine that taps into the dopamine system, can absolutely adopt new rules for reward release in the brain. Again, there's basically only one reward system. There's also serotonin system, as you know, but the dopamine system is the major currency of reward. So much so that, for instance, everyone knows that food is rewarding. We anticipate food. We eat a delicious steak or something, and we feel rewarded. However, if you are somebody who can attach thoughts such as, fasting is good for me, I'm going to do intermittent fasting, or I'm not going to eat those foods, and therefore I'm going to attach my thinking to the rewards that will come with better health, better aesthetics, etc. The dopamine system responds. It's not just a belief in a narrative. It's a real response. And what actually starts to happen is that people start to enjoy the foods that they are restricting themselves to more. There are actually beautiful data on this from my colleague Ali Crum's laboratory at Stanford, that if you believe a food is nutritious and good for you, it actually has better impact on your physiology. Of course, there are the rules of physiology and nutrition that still apply, right? You can't tell yourself that the garbage is good for you, right? But there's a significant scaling up of the positive response that's associated with dopamine and hormonal cascades, which we can talk about in a moment. In the same way, if one adopts a sort of a Carol Dweckian growth mindset approach, okay, it's not about receiving the reward, that the more strain I feel, the more effort that I'm putting in, the closer I'm getting to my goal, that over time will become a rewarding state such that one will pursue states of reaching.
Yeah, well, it should be also proportional to the magnitude of the goal.
That's right.
Right. And so this is, I think, why people are so obsessed in some sense with the search for fundamental meaning. Because you want to be able to associate. So imagine, this is a good story. So you can imagine two people laying bricks. They're building a gigantic wall. And the one person thinks, oh my God, this wall is going to take 100,000 bricks. And I'm laying one at a time. And I'm wasting my life away, trivially adding to this gigantic brick wall. And what am I doing? This is absolutely miserable, brick by brick. And the other person thinks, in 300 years, this is going to be a cathedral. And so the person in the second state is doing exactly the same thing at a local level, laying bricks, but each brick is related to a very high goal. And that means the reward that's attendant upon the laying of the brick is proportional to the goal, to the aim of the entire behavioral process. And so it seems to me, so if you're aimless and goalless, and I know you've done some work on goal setting, if you're aimless and goalless, then you can't elicit any positive emotion. And if your goals are fragmented, which is also what happens if you're aimless or your goals lack unity, if your goals are fragmented, then no given behavioral manifestation can elicit any dopaminergic reward because it's not a step forward to anything desirable. And so there's no positive emotion. And so you can't learn. Well, according to your account, I didn't know that. See, I didn't know that when you put yourself in a state of apprehension in relationship to a valued goal, that your neuroplasticity improves and you can learn better. That's very, very cool.
Yes. So the way one gets to that is by completing things in their immediate environment from start to finish and closing the dopaminergic loop. You literally...
Yeah, well, those are at least micro narratives.
That's right.
Right? So they're not integrated across a long span of time, but they're not nothing. And so one of the things, well, I did write about this in my first book, particularly about putting your house in perfect order. It's like, well, if you're lost, one of the things you can do is look around and see what direction you could take locally, is fix something. And I used to tell my clients, this is a very good thing to know. Find something that you could do that would make things better that you would do. And there's a humility in that too, because especially if you're in a low energy state, it's like, oh my God, I don't have enough energy to make dinner. It's like, do you have enough energy to put a fork on the table? And sometimes people are so depressed that that's really all they can do. It's like, can you take a small step forward, no matter how small that is? And so I knew that adrenaline was a byproduct or down the biochemical chain from dopamine, but I didn't get the significance of that fully. So basically what you're saying is that if you implement a micro routine, even something like washing a cup and putting it back in the shelf, and that's a good thing because you have a shelf and there's cups on it, you've already decided that's an appropriate way to live, is to have your coffee cups on a shelf. If you go ahead with cleaning out the cup and putting it on the shelf, then you've taken steps towards a valuable micro goal. You get a dopamine kick from that. That transforms itself into adrenaline and energizes you.
Which then,
so that's partly the reason that it has an antidepressant effect.
That's right. And then you can lean into another behavior. I mean, some of there's neuroplasticity, which is on the short scale. Completion of an even trivial task like the putting away of the cup will give you more dopamine, which gives you more adrenaline, which in this analogy of either being back on one's heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass, regardless of where one is starting out, let's say depressed is back on one's heels, it's going to tilt you forward a little bit. And then it's a question of what you do with it. So the cognitive appraisal is critical because, again, with the prefrontal cortex being so critical in establishing which of these loops gets repeated, the cognitive appraisal is critical. I'm somebody who can get things done, even if they're small. Now, if you do the cognitive appraisal...
Or you can take another cognitive appraisal there too, which is small things are not small.
That's right.
Precisely for the reason that we just described. It's like you might have the cognitive appraisal that doing something local, like cleaning up your room, is small, but it's not obvious at all that that's the case. It's not that trivial to put your immediate surroundings in order. And it can easily be the stepping stone to putting things in order on a broader scale. In fact, it's probably the necessary stepping stone to do that. And so they might seem small, but they're a step ahead, and ahead is a good direction.
Absolutely.
And so they're not as small as you might think. And so you can pat yourself on the back, especially if you're depressed, a little harder than you might otherwise by saying, you say, well, this is trivial, but I did it. It's like, no, if you're moving ahead, tilting yourself forward in your metaphor, that's not small. You just keep doing that, and you're going to get out of this paralyzed or retreat mode. And then God only knows what you're going to be able to do.
That's right. And I think that if people were to look at these neurological and psychological processes, because we're really talking about both, is as algorithms, right? These are algorithms that have been used by every animal. Think about the animal that's foraging for food. They go down one path, they're surprised they find food. They go down another path, they're sure they're on a scent. They are sure, and then they get nothing. Well, what happens? They learn to remember, they automatically remember everything that led to that failure. And people are very good at remembering that. But be good at remembering the things that led to successes and then ride those neurochemical waves to the next node of exploration. So people imagine failure like crazy, as I'm sure we've all heard and seen. What's critical, again, is this cognitive appraisal, this interpretation of that. If you think of that anxiety as a natural system of getting you to move, of just biasing your body toward movement, toward action, as opposed to inaction, because that's what anxiety really is. It's a bias toward action. Then you can literally reshape the whole notion of what it feels like to have elevated heart rate, maybe trembling hands, maybe flushing of the face when one is doing public speaking. You do it enough times, you get pretty comfortable. One of the things that is absolutely key about the dopamine system is that it has a fast component. Dopamine is released, more adrenaline, aka epinephrine, can be released, and you can, this sort of upward spiral of energy and sort of success with the occasional drops, right? I mean, nobody succeeds in every task, right? Sometimes the phone rings or the doorbell rings and you fail. Goodness, you fail to clean the cup. You come home, like, are you going to crash into a puddle of tears? No, you just clean it then and then put it away, right? Of course. But there's a slow system associated with achieving wins, even small wins. And that slow system is in the form of hormonal control that then translates to gene control. So two hormones in particular, testosterone and estrogen, which are present in both men and women, males and females, of course, but to varying degrees, are both secreted when the dopamine system is activated. They are both vitally important, provided they are in the proper ratios, for motivational biology. And for the following reason: the steroid hormones are so-called lipophilic, and they can cross from the outside of a cell through the cell membrane to actually into the nucleus of a cell and control gene expression. So when we achieve wins repeatedly, and again, this doesn't matter if you're male or female, you achieve wins repeatedly, testosterone is the molecule that eventually accesses not just cells to control their immediate physiology, but goes into the nucleus of those cells and controls their gene expression. And what it translates...
So does that mean, does that mean that demotivated men are producing less testosterone?
We can say that the data show that repeated failures take testosterone levels lower than they would be otherwise. That is not to say that people with low testosterone will always fail. Those with higher testosterone will always win. But just to be clear, because you are correct, but people sometimes get hitched on this causal part. But indeed, one of the quickest ways to boost someone's testosterone is to have them achieve a win of some sort. Now, the win is translated.
Well, one of the things you do in behavior therapy constantly is you help people calibrate the zone of proximal development. So imagine that's Vygotsky's term, right? And so if you're in the zone of proximal development, you're pushing your skill development one increment forward. And it's one that you can actually manage. And so if you see people who are entirely stymied, we're sort of back to the cup of coffee or the coffee cup example, you want to find something they can do locally this week that would constitute at least a micro win. And so you just keep cutting the tasks down week by week until you find the threshold for positive movement forward. And then what's cool about that too is there's a Pareto principle issue associated with it. So if you can find out where the person can start, it isn't linear progress, it's exponential progress forward. And so even if they have to start at a micro level, it doesn't really matter because they get much better at it very, very rapidly as they accrue successes.